In 31 BC, the Roman world held its breath as two fleets faced each other across the Ionian Sea. On one side, Mark Antony and Cleopatra, veterans of a decade of war, surrounded by Egyptian gold and Eastern splendor. On the other side, though, is not young Octavian, whose political genius had carried him this far, but whose military record was still uncertain. The future emperor was far in the north, leading troops that would barely see any fighting. Leading its fleet was Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, the man that would prove that sometimes loyalty is rewarded. In the backstabbing political system of Rome, Agrippa and Augustus went completely against the grain and fused into one person, an unbreakable collaboration that would bring them both to heights they would never see otherwise. We have already talked a little bit about Agrippa in the trilogy of Augustus, but now we focus on the man himself. Ancient sources like Cassius Dio and Appian tell us that Agrippa came from modest stock, perhaps from Arpinium, the same rough Italian soil that had produced Cicero. But what he lacked in ancestry, he made up in an almost mechanical understanding of warfare. He was precise, methodical, unflinching. Appian calls him a man of tireless energy who sought not fame but completion. He never raised monuments to himself, only to Rome. At Actium, Agrippa turned history on itself. But who was the man? Let's get into it. Agrippa was born in 64 BC from an equestrian family. Middle class, respectable but ordinary. He could have been relegated to a dark corner of local administrative Roman history, but when he went to study in Apollonia, he met Gaius Octavius, the grandnephew of Julius Caesar. They were there to get a military and philosophical education, and in 44 BC, the news arrived of Caesar's assassination. Rome was in chaos, Octavian was barely 18, many urged him to flee, disappear, but Agrippa and another friend, Rufus, convinced him to return. That moment sealed a lifetime of loyalty. From the beginning, Agrippa was more than a friend. He was Octavian's anchor. He understood what the young heir did not: the mechanics of command, the patience of logistics, the steady courage of someone who measures victory by endurance, not spectacle. When Octavian faced mutinous legions or the towering charisma of Antony, it was Agrippa who kept the machine of survival running. Cicero, in his letters from those years, mentions Agrippa among the energetic young men who carried the hopes of the new generation. He had no public voice, no senatorial ambition. His gift was function, to act, to organize, to execute. That made him invaluable to a man like Octavian, who needed loyalty more than glory. So Agrippa was primarily a general, at least at the beginning. His greatness, though, did not rest on a single victory or a stroke of genius. It was a pattern, a series of campaigns that defined the logic of Octavian's rise. During the Perusine War in 41 BC, while Lucius Antonius and Fulvia raised Italy against Octavian, Agrippa led the defense of Gaul and the Rhine frontier. Cassius Dio records that he not only held the provinces, but crossed into Germanic lands, establishing temporary forts beyond the Rhine, the first Roman to do so after Caesar. It was an audacious move, designed not to just distract the enemy, but to remind Rome that Octavian still commanded an army that conquered, not merely defended. A political move mixed with a strategic one. Everyone had to remember that not only Octavian was fighting a civil war, but he was still also defending the empire from foreign enemies. But Agrippa's masterpiece came 5 years later, in 36 BC, against Sextus Pompey, the pirate prince of Sicily, son of Pompey the Great and master of the sea. Rome was starving, Sextus controlled the grain routes, and every attempt to break him had failed. Agrippa's solution was not just tactical, it was infrastructural. He built a new harbor from scratch, Portus Julius, by linking two natural lagoons near Naples, the Lucrine and Avernian lakes. and cutting a channel to the sea. It became a secret naval base where he trained fresh crews, experimented with new artillery, and redesigned Roman ships with reinforced prows for ramming. Appian describes how when Agrippa's fleet finally sailed, it was a revelation. Disciplined, silent, and devastatingly fast. At Naulocus, he met Sextus in open battle. The fight was brutal, ship against ship, until Sextus' lines broke and his fleet burned. It was Agrippa, not Octavian, who saved Rome from famine and ended the last Pompeian resistance. Octavian rewarded him with a corona rostrata, a rare crown of gold decorated with the breaks of ships, a distinction not seen since the Punic Wars. Then came Actium, the culmination of Agrippa's genius. By 31 BC, Antony's fleet was larger and better manned, but Agrippa didn't fight him head-on. He waged a campaign of attrition, seizing Metone, Corinth, and Petrae, cutting Antony's communication and driving his fleet into the narrow bay of Actium. When the moment came, Agrippa's ships, the shorter and more maneuverable ships he had created, outflanked Antony's massive but sluggish vessels. Cleopatra's retreat sealed the rout, but it was Agrippa's geometry of the sea that had decided the empire's fate. What's striking is that Agrippa never sought the triumphs due to him. Suetonius notes that Augustus offered him a triumph after defeating Sextus Pompeius. He refused it. When the civil war ended, Agrippa quietly laid down his imperium and returned to private life. But private life for Agrippa meant something very different than what we would think for ourselves. After Actium, Agrippa could have faded into comfortable obscurity. Instead, he turned his military precision towards something more lasting, the remaking of Rome itself. Augustus would later boast that he found a city of brick and left it of marble, but the man who managed that transformation, who turned imperial vision into physical stone, was Agrippa. As aedile in 33 BC, he began a city-wide restoration program, the scale of which Rome had never seen. Cassius Dio writes that he repaired every public building, cleaned the Cloaca Maxima, the city's ancient sewer, and you can imagine what that meant, and restored the aqueducts that time and war had ruined. But he didn't just rebuild, he re-engineered. Agrippa added hundreds of fountains and baths across the city, ensuring water would reach even the poorest of districts. The Aqua Virgo, one of his greatest works, brought fresh water from 20 kilometers away, still flowing today under modern Rome. His architectural legacy was both functional and symbolic. The Pantheon, though later rebuilt by Hadrian, was Agrippa's design, a temple to all the gods set in the Campus Martius, inscribed with his name rather than Augustus. For the people, it was a place of devotion, for Augustus, a monument to the new harmony between heaven and empire. Nearby rose the Baths of Agrippa, the first large-scale public therme in Rome. A palace of marble and heat, open to citizens of every class. It wasn't luxury for the few, but comfort for the many. That was Agrippa's quiet revolution, civic grandeur as public right. And isn't that something we associate with Rome itself, with the Roman Empire itself, the ability of the people to access these grand buildings, these grand services, that, in his imperial version, began with Agrippa. The Stagnum Agrippae, an artificial lake surrounded by gardens and statues, became a symbol of Roman abundance, a space where the commoners would walk among marble gods. He changed the urban planning of the city. His network of porticos, gardens, and theaters transformed the city from a maze of republican chaos into something orderly and monumental. Agrippa's philosophy was simple. Rome should be worthy of the empire it ruled. His public works were acts of propaganda, but not marble vanity. They were propaganda in function. The aqueduct, the bath, the fountain, each whispered the same message. Peace has replaced chaos. Stability has replaced ambition. But what about family? By the last decade of the 1st century BC, Agrippa was more than Augustus' right hand, he was part of his family. In 21 BC, Augustus arranged a marriage that astonished Rome. Agrippa, nearly 43, wed Julia the Elder, Augustus' only daughter, barely in her 20s. The union was not romantic, it was dynastic. By marrying Julia, Agrippa entered the Julian line itself, becoming both son-in-law and political partner with Augustus. His previous marriages, including one to Marcella, Octavia's daughter, had already tied him to the imperial household, but this was something deeper. Augustus, ever cautious, was securing the future by binding it to the one man he truly trusted. Octavia would be the elder sister of Augustus, by the way. The marriage was fruitful and its consequences profound. From it came 5 children: Gaius, Lucius, Agrippina the Elder, Julia the Younger, and Agrippina Postumus. The first 2 were adopted by Augustus as his heirs, their education shaped by the same moral discipline that had defined their grandfather by marriage. Agrippina, Agrippa's daughter, would one day give birth to Caligula and raise Nero. Through blood and legacy, Agrippa became the invisible patriarch of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Yet his position was not without tension. When Agrippa was sent east in 17 BC with Imperium Maius, the same supreme authority Augustus himself held, it was both in honor and exile. Some scholars suggest Augustus wanted him distant enough to avoid jealousy at Rome. Others, that he trusted him more than anyone to keep the empire's edges stable. In the east, Agrippa visited the Black Sea, governed Asia, and negotiated with Parthia, securing the safe return of Roman standards lost by Crassus decades earlier, an achievement even Caesar had failed to claim. But his life, built on service, ended too soon. In 12 BC, while on campaign in Campania, Agrippa fell ill and died at just 51. Suetonius tells us Augustus mourned him deeply, refusing to attend public business for days, and personally delivering his eulogy. He buried Agrippa in his own mausoleum, beside himself and his family, an honor granted to no other man outside the Julian blood. With his death, Augustus lost a part of himself, his one true equal. Later emperors recognized the debt they had to Agrippa. Claudius studied his administrative reforms. Hadrian, the architect emperor, rebuilt Agrippa's temple not as a replacement, but as an act of reverence. In every dome, every arch, every ordered street, it was Agrippa's logic that endured, the geometry of a man who thought in systems, not symbols. Yet history rarely rewards the second man. Augustus became the eternal name, the golden age, the image of peace. Agrippa, a footnote, his genius absorbed into the machinery of empire he had built. But perhaps that was always his intention. He had never sought glory, only permanence. His works spoke for him in stone and water, in roads that reached the edges of the known world. He made himself Augustus' shadow, and by the permanence of Augustus' name, he too survives forever. When we walk through Rome today, through Piazza della Rotonda where the Pantheon still stands, through the aqueducts that still whisper under the city, we are in a sense walking through Agrippa's Rome. A Rome not of marble triumph, but of function, endurance, and quiet perfection.